Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to WishwaTalks. My name is Mani. Thank you all for attending today's event. For those of you who have been on a WishwaTalk before, a warm welcome back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, here's a little bit about us. WishwaTalks is an initiative by Wishwa.org. Wishwa.org is an online platform for everyday change makers and social champions. It's a crowdfunding and crowdsourcing platform that is aimed at helping anyone find the support they need in their efforts and endeavors to solve problems for themselves and for others, and in the process, make the world a better place. Wishwa Talks are a series of weekly webinars hosted every Saturday that are focused on gaining in-depth knowledge from the experts on a wide range of topics that are pertinent to the current context.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for joining Teacher Plus and Wishwa Talks. For what promises to be a stimulating discussion around a subject that often goes overlooked in conversations around education, literacy, schooling, and in general social and cultural development. Something that serves the twin purposes of pleasure and learning. The physical space of a library has been, at different times and in different places, a space that pulls together not only books, but also people. They've been crucibles of revolutionary and path-breaking activities and have been meeting places for many different kinds of people and materials. But in recent years, as we've retreated further and further into the small devices in our hands and on our desks, the pull of the physical library is fast disappearing. And with it, there's the danger of losing a certain kind of civic space. Some of us of a certain age can remember having to go to the library to get a book, to find out things, to even read a newspaper or a magazine that we couldn't subscribe to. Public and community libraries, and to a large extent school libraries, were spaces where the access divide could be bridged. You could read or borrow books that you couldn't afford, and in the anterooms and lobbies and steps of the library, you could form relationships with other readers or seekers of knowledge. But libraries are neither incidental nor simply instrumental spaces. As the title of this panel suggests, they are about much more than a collection of books, although careful curation is not only important, but central to the purpose of a library. These days, we talk about a digital divide and ways to close the gap by offering access to devices and broadband. But libraries, physical spaces, do much more to address a more fundamental gap in access to knowledge resources for both pleasure and profit. Today, our two speakers will talk about how they've attempted to close that access divide with libraries, reimagined for a variety of contexts. A disclaimer as we begin. This is a topic that we can have whole conferences about, and so what we hope to do is to simply begin the conversation so that all of you can take it forward in your own communities. At Teacher Plus, we've had the good fortune to have hosted such conversations for a while now, with many contributions from a range of people invested in the idea and the practice of library making. And I can see some of them in the audience. Thank you so much for attending. So let's get right down to it. Our two speakers, Sujata Noronha of Bookworm and Amrita Patwardhan of Tata Trust and Parag, are both library advocates and library makers. They will draw from their experiences to open up the question of what a library can be and why we should care about it. Do keep your questions and comments ready, as we hope to use their talks to open up a good discussion. So over to you, Sujata.
Thank you, Usha. And thank you, Wishwa Talks, for selecting this theme of libraries. And before I begin, I want to thank this really large and exciting number of participants who chose to attend this webinar. I'm sure Saturday mornings you have many choices and you made this choice. So really, on behalf of all of us who work in this space, sometimes feel alone, sometimes think it doesn't matter, I think it's acts like this that kind of reinforce that we are all interested in what comes, becomes, and is happening to libraries. So thank you. And I wanted to start at the very, very beginning, which is really what comes to mind when we think of libraries. Because as I dwell more and more into why we are not in the fullness of practice? Why are we not at the center of everybody's imagination? Why are we still struggling to find reflection in policy and practice? I feel the roots are much deeper. And one idea that came to my mind is library is a noun, right? It's a common noun. It's something that when you hear this word library, immediately some imagination pops up. And all of us feel, and rightly so, that we understand what a library is. And that kind of closes our own imagination and scope to explore library as even being something that we did not think or experience it as. So I've been doing my own little pop surveys over the years, just asking people what they think of libraries. And it came from a very small repeated anecdote that happened in my professional life. When people will learn what I do, that I work in the library, there was always benign response of positive benign response, like how lovely, and what else do you do? So how do you engage yourself? How are you keeping active? Because I'm known as this vibrant busybody. And it seemed like, library couldn't possibly occupy all the hours of your day. And this has begun to intrigue me, because it means we assume and take for granted certain imaginations of what library is. And just for the sake of taking this conversation further, I'm assuming these are the top three. I don't have really solid evidence, but I don't think I'm completely wrong either. When we say the word library, we often think of a space, a structure. Those of us who've grown up in older cities, we have a colonial imagination for the library, so it's often an imposing building. Those of us who have the privilege of going to colleges with libraries, that pops up in our mind. Some of us who went to mission schools have those experiences of libraries, but they're particular imagination. Some of us have the imagination of the lovely circulating library around the corner, but they're often these physical structures that come into our mind. And from there, we begin to think, oh, this is what library is. For many of us, the collection matters. What kind of books, how many books, what type of books, what's the condition of the books, how many can I take? So collection comes very closely to structure. So they sort of go together. You think of a space, you think of books, and our imagination about libraries nestles there. Recently, because of some of my colleagues who've done small studies in working with public libraries, trying to revive children's sections in public libraries, we've understood that procedures also deter public from actively becoming members. So how many copies of your Aadhaar card, residence card, Mamladar certificate, photographs, what is it that you require in order to say, I deserve membership to a library? For private libraries, it could often be fees, the nature of security deposit. For many people, even in my small state in Goa, it is logistic. So where are you located? Because we don't have a vibrant public transport system. So where are you located? How will we get there? What timings do you keep? So these are some of the influences that kind of form this construct of what we all think library is. But I'm quite convinced about it, and I'm arguing for it, that what doesn't immediately come to mind for most of us is who's in the library. What is this person doing? Who is this person? The richest experiences I've harvested on this component that S.R. Ranganathan called the human constituent is from school children. All of us who look back on our school lives or school children presently in schools have wonderful, particular experiences to share about the library teacher or the librarian. And they're often very positive or very negative or even invisibilized. I'll ask them, so what's your librarian's name? And you see absolute, blank gaze, because this imagination that a library actually, its critical component is the people, for some reason, which we'll come to, doesn't come immediately to our mind for most of us. Yes, I'm hedging and I'm not saying these as absolute truths, but I'm placing them for us to talk more about. Yet we know in our work, in all our work across library spaces, if you talk to people who are working with libraries, it's the people, not just the people running the library, but who comes to our library, our community, our teachers. It's truly the human constituent that actually enables us to have rich practices. And it's something I feel we need to move further forward in our line of thinking. We need to begin by thinking about who, why, what is the human constituent of the library. I also pushed my own thinking to wonder, why are we this way? I've been so excited to find a seminal piece of work, 2 pages, in an essay by Rabindranath Tagore called How Big Is Your Library? Written in 1929, that's nearly close to 100 years back. And such a powerful essay that asks us and that says, your library is not a library by its size or collection or catalog. Please remember, this is 90 odd years back. This is a time when books were expensive. They couldn't have been much access. They couldn't have been very, 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 very large collections. And still, we had inhabited a colonial imagination that your library is based on its size. And he questions this in this little essay, saying that it's not size, but it must have an introduction, which I'm taking to mean a purpose. It must have an invitation and a spirit of welcome. And for me, an invitation and a spirit of welcome has to be reposed in the human constituent. It doesn't have to be the person running the library alone. So many spaces, our children are our spirit of welcome. They're so excited by the library that they enable other people to come in to look and see what's happening. And I want us to just take 20 seconds to read this one quote that I extracted from the text. And we'll do it quietly just to allow this to sink in. Thank you. So for me, the core of this particular quote is for us who work in the space. It's not just about gathering books. It's not about shelving. It's not only about cataloging, but it's about actively acquainting whoever comes into my library with what this collection is and interesting them in the contents, which means I need to also be fully aware, if not know, at least aware of what this collection is. So you can find this essay on archive.org, and I urge all of us here who are interested to just return to it. It's simple, but it's seminal, but it's so telling, perhaps in a way of why we've not moved in our imagination for libraries. I've also been thinking, if we'll go further, Mani, please. I've also been thinking there are other reasons why we haven't moved. Our own understanding. Yes, all of us are busy doing so many things. People like me, Amrita, our dearest friend Usha, we're immersed in this work. So of course we are thinking all the time and buzzing about library. But can we expect this from everybody else, or are we part of that community that needs to bring this to everybody else? What have been my experiences with library? I meet hundreds of people, adults and children, who've not even had experiences with library. So to then expect them to understand what we are trying to do, to immediately immerse themselves, to pick up the work and carry forward, seems slightly foolhardy. So taking into account what are my own experiences with library, how can I reflect and rethink and reimagine from there? And our community who work in this space, how responsible are we for invisibilizing ourselves? Why are we as a community of professionals who work in library not also the biggest brand ambassadors for librarianship? What is happening there? Is it the training? Is it the nature of the job? Is it the way other constituents look at us? We must examine this. So I placed these here, and I want to say it's not so simple despite all of this. There are many things that are happening around library that are also affecting library. And I want to again place them for our consideration. I'm calling them the shifting sands. who we are running libraries for, this has changed in the last 100 years for sure. From these places of quiet scholarship, silence, research, and further study, we now see libraries, as Usha said in her introduction, as really vital spaces. Vitality will require so much of dynamism, so much of fluidity, that the scholarly quiet may just be one aspect. Whom we are welcoming. Libraries were not even open to children till less than 100 years back. So suddenly we want the youngest of children to walk into libraries. We want people who've never read before to come into libraries. So whom are these libraries for is impacting what libraries do and how vital they can be. Why have libraries? Again, it's changed, right? Significantly changed. What are we hoping to achieve by running libraries? It's not just benign goodness. It's not an institution that we just want for social good because it's important. A city must have a library. We firmly believe that libraries do something to us as human beings, as citizens, as a community, as a society. So how are we examining this? Where are the spaces where we're dialoguing and talking about this? Critical, I feel, for us to revitalize. What do we understand about libraries? And I've said that before, I'm bringing it back. This big game changer of technology. About 15 years back, everybody thought Bookworm, this really small library, would close because suddenly there was an explosion of devices on which we thought we could read. It's astounding. Our collection has more than tripled. The number of children we reach has perhaps gone up by 4 or 5 times. We're working with an army of communities and adults who now we engage with, and we feel a deep sisterhood. And technology has not killed us. It's just enabled so much more. But we've been always reflective about the use of technology, and I think that's important. And critical in our pursuit of where and why we want libraries is to remember that we are talking of access in a country of, billions of people. How many have this access? How do we enable this access? Whom do we empower so that we have hundreds and thousands of little libraries and that we have many, many children experiencing them? How do I step aside to enable somebody else to also come in right here and also talk about libraries? I think these are such important things that swill in my mind as I think about what do we value and why libraries are not just about books. I want to close with a 2-minute video of the voices of children who have experienced libraries and describe what the library is for them. And thank you so much for listening.
लायब्ररी हा माझा मित्र आहे. त्यात राहणारे पुस्तक कधी पण आमच्या बरोबर असतात.
Library is like a food item with a whole bunch of ingredients and things from everywhere which you mix together and consume.
लायब्ररी हा एक पाण्याचा झरा आहे कारण त्यात पाण्यासारखा शब्द वाहत असतात.
लाइब्रेरी मेरे लिए ऐसी है जैसे कि फूलों का बगीचा, और उस फूलों के बगीचे में बहुत से सुंदर फूल हैं जो मुझे किताबों जैसे लगते हैं.
Library is like my home, cozy and comfortable.
Library is a space where you can find words to your imagination.
ते भुरग्यांक लागून धगधगता रगता भाशेन व्हांवतात ते तशें आमच्या आंगात इन्फॉर्मेशन भरता. लायब्ररी एक चित्र कशें तातूंत भुरग्यांनी बरिल्ली रंग आसा.
माझी लायब्ररी अशी आहे जसं गावाकडून एक अंधाराची पूर्ण काळोखाची रात्र व त्यात शांत चमकणारे तारे. तसेच माझी लायब्ररीतील पुस्तकं.
Thank you so much, Sujata. That was a wonderful sort of introduction to all the different ways in which we can think about what it means to have a library and be within a library. So we'll move on to Amrita, who will look at this question from a slightly different perspective. Amrita?
Thank you, Usha. Thank you, Vishwa team, for giving us this opportunity to connect with so many people in the audience, which is a mixed audience who all care about libraries, and such a wonderful video, Sujata. Clearly, these children have really experienced the warmth of a library, and that really comes through from the video. So thank you so much. So extending really the framework that Sujata has set for us in terms of what really library means, when I reflect on the last year, and we all have been grappling with the pandemic and the schools being closed, and one section of the society very quickly embracing the online and being very, in a way, euphoric about online, while we also very quickly realize that the whole online space, given the digital divide and many other challenges, has very, very severe limitations. And especially when we looked at the kind of locations where we were working, which are primarily rural, and a lot of it is in aspirational districts, and basically with online connectivity where that was not really a choice. In a way, what came really forward as a strong way to keep the connect with learning going with children was emergence of community libraries for us. And that's the small journey that I'm going to share with you, primarily through pictures, and drawn basically from a lot of community library work that emerged, a lot of school library work that turned into community library work when school libraries were closed and schools were closed, and the manner in which that helped us revisit some of these very important tenets about what a library is. So in terms of library, I think the reader is at the heart of the library. The user of the library is at the heart of the library. Space, in a way, is incidental. It can be anywhere. As important as the collection and the reader is, of course, a facilitator, a library educator, like we like to call her. In this case, it's a government school teacher. It could be anyone who, however, has been trained, has been facilitated, has engaged with the process of how does she become a link between her children and the collection, and how is she able to forge a friendship between the two. And it is easier said than done, but I think a level of investment which had happened in a way in what Sujata called the human constituent, one was able to build on that. Of course, there are plenty of challenges, but when you have a good collection and a cadre of people who have had an engagement with stories and books and their understanding of children, and why reading is so vital to the process of learning and growing of children, I think a lot of that came in handy when the libraries, in a way, flourished at a community setting. In a way, open libraries, Usha has extensively talked about it, and in terms of children having the choice of what they want to select, but have a person who can guide them when required. It whole thing also acquired another meaning in terms of completely open spaces where preferably all these interactions were facilitated, and we saw a very overwhelming almost response from children, because they were also, I think, feeling very cooped up inside their homes. Schools were closed. The linkage with the process of learning, process of peer interaction, being able to interact with somebody, caring adult, all of those elements in a way came together in the community library space. And in a way, a lot of effort to mobilize children which we otherwise anticipate, we saw a lot of spontaneous response from children out there looking forward to those couple of hours of learning centers and the library sessions. This whole little ways in which some of these practices that we talk about of children being able to choose, but out of a curated, carefully curated collection, in terms of they having space to read, browse at their own pace and space. Also, one very wonderful thing about community libraries that we saw, that while we were primarily running them in order to reach children, of course, there was that awareness that community libraries can be for anyone, but we did not have any specifically curated kind of a collection for different ages. But that collection itself can be relevant for any reader. And we saw literally all age groups being drawn to community libraries, and that was very reassuring for us to see. The whole importance of a curated collection, different genre, again, very long way to go in this, especially in regional languages, in settings, tribal settings, where we are working with very, very few books are there in the mother tongues. But it's very, very important to keep nourishing also that space of good quality material coming out, getting curated and reaching places where sort of this efforts to create these inviting spaces for readers is going on. And from poetry to picture books to fiction, non-fiction, variety of kinds of books, I think it's very, very important for us to reach them through these different library spaces. Another important thing that some of our field teams have consciously shared with us, and which I felt was so very important, that libraries also became an inclusive space at a village level for all children to access, because typically there is, even at the village level, perhaps depending on the setting, there is a variation in that, but there is a stratification of children who go to private schools versus children who go to government schools. They're not necessarily mingling together. And while it started initially as a more tentative kind of a step, slowly this became a space that everybody wanted to be part of and found value in, which I thought was very, very important. When we talk about inclusion in library, it took a different dimension. The kind of enthusiasm that we saw from mothers, parents, grandparents, siblings, also those who were non-literate or semi-literate. And I think the power that we talk about, both for children, we saw it also for adults, that in terms of pictures also being the entry point into books. And really, when Sujata spoke about structure and the space, any space where there is a reader, there is a facilitator, and there is a good collection, it is as appropriate or more appropriate to be a library. So those are all the different things that we were reminded of in a way through the journey of the last year. Lending, borrowing, this is again a picture of recently, while the schools are closed, teachers are supposed to come to the school, and now we are seeing like children also coming to the library for lending, borrowing purpose, while the school per se hasn't opened up. And different forms of these under the tree kind of open libraries, or a Jola library with a volunteer going to different tolas with a collection, and parents or even some children coming forward to set up a mini library in their own home. These are all different forms that evolved. It was not something which was planned and then implemented. It kind of evolved from the ground, and that's what really reassured us that a lot of investment in people which had been done on importance of library and keeping it alive in any location, space, and typically what the initial investment really was in setting up school libraries, but the way in which it responded through the last year, that is something which helped us underline, and different forms of libraries kind of evolved out of that, or a mini library getting set up at a school management members' home, which they said that we can offer a corner where book collection can be set up. Of course, not to forget the school libraries. As the schools are reopening, we are hoping that we would be able to welcome children in an inviting kind of a space. And this again is a picture, in fact, when the schools are still shut, but the library rooms are being periodically accessed both through the community volunteers as well as the school teachers coming and offering engagement with children. So basically, in terms of the curated collection, the library educator and the interaction that the library educator creates with that collection through an inviting ambience. Such a wonderful piece, Sujata, you shared about Rabindranath. I must read that immediately after this. And all of this somewhere is able to help us create an engaged reader. And while last year had lots of difficulties, and I'm not underplaying that, but in a way, through all those difficulties, it was very, very reassuring for us that many other pathways of reaching children, while we struggled a lot more, possibly some level of past engagement in building curated collections, in creating cadre of trained educators who understand library and its power in a deep way, and how to create that engagement around books with children from all diverse backgrounds, but especially children who are coming from first generation learners from non-literate homes. I think all of that in a way for us played out, and I wanted to share that journey with you. I'll not take more time. We'll pause here and we'll be very happy to take your questions.
I see a lot of appreciative comments in the chat box and a couple of questions as well, and we certainly will address them. And I think both presentations gave us a lot to think about in terms of how we position libraries in our imagination and what we do about it, right? And I think what we've been able to do is to sort of recover the notion of the library as a somehow elite space, that a rarefied kind of space that only scholars access to, and making it, or perhaps more properly positioning it as a community resource, however one might imagine that community, right? So it could be the community of a school or a village or a neighborhood or a community of scholars, of course. So I think, two things that struck me. One, in terms of what Sujata was talking about in relation to the human quotient, right? And our imagination of the librarian, as opposed to just the library, and how important our valuation of this role of the human quotient is, in both in terms of how we invest in developing this, like Amrita mentioned, at the community level, but also in terms of how we invest in it as a system of education, right? And nurturing people who have this ability to draw books and people together. So I'm just wondering, what has been our failure in that regard? And, while efforts like you are making at Bookworm and the efforts that Amrita is talking about work ground up, certainly, what might we be able to do from a systemic perspective to meet that effort from the ground up? So, so that's one question. I'm not sure if it's too abstract, but is there a way we can think about it?
It's such a wonderful question, because it's something that emerged very early in conversations with Amrita, when Usha, Mukunda and I were part of also supporting Parag at Tata Trust. And this gap in looking at even school education and looking at the role of the library for growing children, we've somehow not caught up with what we now know about childhood, what we know about learning, what we know about reading, and what we know about access to books. Somehow that's not caught up in librarianship training, professional courses that we're calling library information system. You have certificate courses, graduation courses, and master's courses. Where is the childhood, early education, elementary education in that piece? It's actually quite absent. And so it was really because I feel the vision of Amrita that we need to invest in this, we conceptualize this library educators course that we offer as a certificate course that's really aimed and designed at that gap. But we can, both between Parag and Bookworm, do very small cohorts every year. It's a drop. How do we institutionalize this in teacher training colleges, in diets? I really think that should be our way forward, because we're not saying the same course, but you could actually draw from it and in my head just very easily systematize it, because we've done 5-7 years now. If we look at our pilot, our early Hindi courses, more than 7 years, 8 years. And I feel that's robust. There's something good in that format, structure, what happens to the individual in the course of those 6 months that can enable this professional space. So how do we carve within library science degrees a piece for, librarians who work with children and young people? I hope
just to add a small point to what Sujata said, I think recognizing that librarian for children is a specialized area and it needs to be invested in itself is a idea that we all as a society need to accept and engage with, because it's otherwise assumed that, okay, you have library science courses and that's a generic field, and once you are expert in that, it will automatically happen. But we know for sure that it doesn't happen automatically, and we need to invest in building that understanding about children, about collection, about that library or library educator, also familiarizing himself, herself with the collection and the process of reading. So there are a whole host of in a way specialized things that are required in order to train a person to be a good librarian for children. I think that idea, once we believe in, then different pathways can be found to reach there. But I think that central acceptance is where I feel we need to start.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of questions in my head in ways that we can take these ideas forward. But I'm thinking the moment you talk about institutionalizing, there's also a loss of imagination. So somehow, as you deepen institutionalization, you also tend to, I think it's inversely proportional to imagination in those spaces. And so, the kind of examples you presented, and, we have Usha Mukunda here, who's been an inspirational librarian. And I'm wondering what the notion of ownership has to do with all of this, right? So the library as a space of collective ownership, as opposed to a library as a space that has these valuable resources that often have to be locked up in closets, in cupboards, and a librarian, often a stern person, has complete control over who has access to those resources. So in a way, the kind of community library idea you've opened up, and the sort of libraries that Usha Mukunda has been instrumental in kind of nurturing, completely radicalize that notion, right? Of this is a resource that has to be taken care of by a particular person. So I don't know if I'm being clear here, but how does the notion of ownership and the collective nature of that ownership, how can that infuse our imagination of libraries, both in schools and in communities?
To me, Amrita, I'll go first.
Yeah, please.
To me, the immediate response is if we kind of, return to this idea that, this idea even that S.R. Ranganathan speaks of when he talks of the human constituent in the library. There's this really sweet little anecdote that when he was first asked to take over as the librarian of Madras University, and he was a teacher before that and had such close interaction with students, just the thought that he'll be alone in the library with books and the kind of alienation that was present at the time led him to go and meet the person in charge and say he thinks it would be too lonely and he doesn't want this job. And he was then urged to go and do some observation studies and come back. And I really believe that something shifted in when he realized that you're never alone in the library. I mean, I think that's that if you shift there and you realize that actually it's you and the readers, it's you and the community, it's you and whoever is using this space and the potential to use the space who actually own the library, something shifts. So this idea of, self and property, the library demands us to re-examine that because it is a social good. I think even a private library is there so that you become a better human being for society, right? What will you do with all that understanding if you just harbor it? So that shift within us, I think changes our notion of then who owns the library. And when that happens, it's remarkable to experience what ownership can be reposed in the youngest of children and what strong ambassadors they become for care, for promotion, for everything. And my guru really, for want of a better word, sorry, Usha Mukunda, is the work that Usha Mukunda placed before us. When she uses the term open library, she doesn't mean just access and not closed cupboards. It's also I'm open. So I have to be as ready to listen as I am to share. So to me, it's about the shift in me. I don't feel that, otherwise words are very easy to bandy. Yeah, now I don't know how to do that, but I believe it's possible.
To add something.
The only thing I wanted to say was that if the reader, we are able to make him or her the center of the library and ask ourselves that are we reaching and servicing and engaging the reader? I think these different things that you talked about, that the librarian being primarily somebody who is keeping the collection very safely, to focusing on the reader and being able to engage the reader. I think that shift somewhere, wherever, even in our library educators course journey, for certain people, when we see that shift, I think we see many of the then different ways you can find them, whatever is suitable in your context, in your school, in your community. So the pathways can be different. Primarily their library as a space is to nurture readers. I think that's where somewhere I feel that shift helps us do things differently and help build that community, and also then different people take ownership, or you allow them to take ownership. So even in some of the most remotest areas, not primary school children, but middle school onwards, children taking responsibility through the library committees to manage lending, borrowing, for example, or the basic management happens if you allow that kind of space. And for the teacher also to not feel burdened that everything in the library only has to be managed by him or her. So I think it's a gradual process, but will only happen through the kind of engagement with the human element, if we go back to that term.
Questions have to do with how do we connect existing school libraries with the community? So is it possible to, in a way, repurpose or extend the notion of a school library to becoming a community library? And have you all done that in the various interventions that you've engaged with?
Yeah, actually, what I shared was effectively not at all started as a community library work. And we do hope that as we move forward and the schools reopen, school libraries will continue to be the focus of the work, but the community spaces that have kind of opened up, we don't leave them. But effectively what we saw through some of the glimpses of different geographies that we saw, all was work which was primarily done to set up school libraries. But in the last year, we saw the schools were closed and collection was sitting inside the school and not accessible. With the permission from the school and the teacher, it was possible to bring it out in the community. So it's very, very possible. In another time, I would have said it in a more theoretical way that yes, it is possible, but I can say it with conviction because we saw it happen in multiple locations. So I think if we are able to build that demand from the community at one end, as well as support and willingness from the school library can be a very beautiful resource for the larger community. And in the past, we have, for example, not really run community libraries, but when the schools are shut or during the summer vacations, if we typically are using the school space to run, say, a summer camp, you can really invite a lot of members through the year. You can invite them, but the library can be a space where you can invite community members to share stories and different skills as well. So that's one way, and also opening up the collection for different people to access, and lending, borrowing in the school library also helps you connect the homes with the library. So there are different ways in which it can be done. I think it's really what stops us is our imagination and nothing else.
Sujata, you want to add anything to that?
No, I was just thinking, one thing we shouldn't do is return to the old ways, right? I think, like Amrita said, this link has formed. How do we kind of make it part of, yes. But I would think even a standalone school library that perhaps didn't open up during the pandemic should actually be scoping where it can get more resources from, how children, we don't encourage that as just, I don't know, community of educators. We seem to be content as a school library. So I think every school should ask its children to become part of the public library, for example, or the panchayat library, because there is never a limit to how much of access is enough. And we know communities where there are panchayat libraries and nobody is going, where there are taluka libraries and nobody is going. So as just people in society, how can we leverage all these spaces? Just because my school has a library, I don't think it's enough. For me, a movement would come like that everything will get energized. If even as civilians, we ask of the systems that are existing to deliver libraries, resources to us. So it's both, it's not just the institutions to be active, but also us in society to draw on these existing systems. Yeah.
So another set of questions has to do with the digital, and I just wanted to add a layer to that. So one is, how does one think about libraries in the age of the digital? And the second question related to that is, how do we manage copyright violation in terms of e-copies, in terms of a school library, which perhaps is a slightly more specialized question. But I also wanted to add to that the notion of discernment, right? Which is a big problem today in terms of there is a whole lot of access to digital resources for some. And what one doesn't have in dealing with those resources is the curatorial guidance of a librarian. So while one has increased access theoretically to material, you really have not developed a means or a skill to understand what belongs with what, and does one trust random links that are embedded, and those kinds of things. So I guess this is a complex question, but yeah, do you have anything to say about it?
My God, I think there are 3 questions in this.
I mean, you can say if it's outside the scope of this discussion.
No. I think the idea of the curatorial is so critical. For me, it goes back to that human constituent, the investment in the capacity of those of us who work in library, how deeply I know my collection. I think for me, that's so critical. And you're absolutely right. We are meeting children who about the process to digitize a collection. We've made a conscious choice at Bookworm to stay with the physical, because we developed the best way to bring young the act of reading with books. But we've used technology extensively in this time to connect with people.
And the only point I wanted to add was that while this person who can help you suggest, curate, give recommendations, or be there to listen is very, very critical. I think in the last year, again, probably more than before, we've also seen that also can perhaps take different forms. The library need not become e-library, but you may reach out to a friend for recommendations, or you read a review or a blog, or different ways in which recommendations also can happen. And the in-person recommendation and a warm person touch and feel you can reach out to is very, very critical for children. But there are also widened ways in which you can seek recommendations. And I think Bookworm itself has now started a library that they post books also to people who are outside of Goa. So there are so many possibilities, while I think the person who cares and has a good understanding of collection being able to recommend is the central part. Sometimes it can happen physically, sometimes it can happen through technology. Those are more ways of reaching there, I feel. But I think in the copyright issue, I feel that since there is a whole section of publishing which also adheres to open source licensing itself, those books are out there in the open source. So if somebody is using e-collection, I think the librarian can pay attention to that, that you're not violating copyright. And there are, like, I think Sujata mentioned archive.org. There are other platforms which curate, or some of them are not highly curated. That can be a problem, but there are e-spaces where a lot of collections are available, which are largely in open source or put there with permission, or they are past their copyright. So there are different ways in which you can have collection which is not violating copyright, but can be accessed.
So, actually, it would be nice to hear some voices from the audience. So if anybody would like to make a comment, add an experience, or ask a question, please do so by raising your hand and then unmuting.
हेलो, हेलो, नमस्कार सबको। मैं हेमंत बोल रहा हूँ। आपको मेरी आवाज आ रही है?
जी, we can hear you.
क्योंकि इस पर्टिकुलर वेबिनार में हमारे कुछ हिंदी स्पीकिंग साथी भी जुड़े हुए हैं, और मतलब मैं उनके पक्ष से भी ये सवाल पूछना चाह रहा हूँ कि जो लाइब्रेरी मूवमेंट है, मतलब ये काफ़ी इम्पोर्टेंट तो है, और जो हमारे साथी है, और मैं भी क्या नाम है, उत्तराखंड से आता हूँ, रिमोट क्षेत्र से। तो कुछ लोग हैं जो छत्तीसगढ़ से हैं, उत्तराखंड से हैं, तो हम लोग लाइब्रेरी के बारे में बहुत सारी चीज़ें नहीं जानते, बट हमें इतना पता है कि ये पेंडेमिक के दौरान लर्निंग लॉस हुआ है, जिसके कारण हम लोग ने कुछ किया है। मतलब 20 वॉलंटियर ने मिलकर 10 गांव में कुछ छत्तीसगढ़ में किया है, और उत्तराखंड में भी इस तरह की चीज़ें हो रही है। तो हम जो इतने दूर से हैं, हो सकता है कि तकनीकी रूप से भी जुड़ ना पाए, तो आप हमें किस तरह का मतलब सपोर्ट देंगे, किस तरह की गाइडेंस देंगे? अगर हमारा उस तरह का बैकग्राउंड भी ना हो एजुकेशन का, है ना, तो हम किस तरह से जुड़ सकते हैं? कौन आपकी तरफ से हमें गाइड कर सकता है? किस तरह की किताबें यूज करनी चाहिए हमें? तो वो थोड़ा संक्षिप्त में बताएंगे। कोई भी दूर के जो ऐसे क्षेत्र से आते हैं तो मदद करेगा काफी।
हेमंत जी, थैंक यू। और आप जैसे लोग जो अलग अलग रिमोट एरियाज में अपनी तरीके से कोशिश कर रहे हैं, आई थिंक वो एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण बात है। और यदि आपकी इच्छा है कि कुछ करें किताबों के भी साथ, तो फिर बहुत सारे रास्ते खुल सकते हैं। बहुत सारी छोटी मोटी चीजें इस पे लिखी गई है जो पढ़ के थोड़ा आइडिया ले सकते हैं। कुछ ऑनलाइन वीडियोस हैं, हिंदी में भी है, कि किस तरीके की गतिविधियां बच्चों के साथ किताबों के साथ कर सकते हैं। तो आप जरूर हमें लिखिए, मैं थोड़ा और शेयर कर पाऊंगी, लेकिन मैं इतना ही कह रही हूँ कि अभी ओपन सोर्स में भी कुछ आइडियाज हैं जो आपको मिल सकते हैं। लाइब्रेरी की किताबें चुनने में भी एक वो लंबी प्रोसेस है, 2 मिनट में ऐसे नहीं समझा सकते हैं, लेकिन कुछ रेकमेंडेड बुक लिस्ट भी हैं जिससे आप शायद शुरुआत कर सकते हैं। जहां आपके क्षेत्र में शायद वो गांव में नहीं हो, लेकिन उस क्षेत्र में काम करने वाले लोगों से इस तरीके के रिकमेंडेशन से शुरुआत की जा सकती है, और वो धीरे धीरे फिर आपकी और बच्चों की आइडियाज से बुक कलेक्शन धीरे धीरे बढ़ सकता है। तो मैं इतना ही अभी कहना चाहूंगी कि ओपन सोर्स में कई सारे रिसोर्सेस की रिकमेंडेशन लेने के लिए पॉसिबल है, वहां से शुरुआत करते हुए उस पे शायद बिल्ड कर सकते हैं.
Good afternoon to everyone. And as such, I am a librarian in Bhavans, Raipur. And Hemant ji, I heard he is also, I think, of Uttarakhand, and he is also working in Chhattisgarh with the library, for the library for those remote areas, and it is very nice to hear from him. I can also help him in if he can contact me personally through mail. I can share my mailing address to him. And it is nice here listening, ma'am, Sujata ma'am, and Aparna ma'am, and got a new insight to, as we are dealing with school libraries, and we are doing work with the small kids also. And I always like to have books related to students of JKG level to 12th. So I always try that students should be encouraged to read more and more. And from listening from the more experienced person helps us also. Thank you, ma'am. And please give us more insights into this type of work so that we can also have more idea to increase the service provided to the students. Thank you.
Good afternoon, speakers. First of all, thank you for this wonderful session. My actually question is to both Sujata ma'am and Amrita ma'am. You were both talking about the sense of ownership. So could you actually throw more light about it in with respect to library, please?
Yeah, thank you, Sigi. The way I look at it, libraries used to be repositories, right, where collections existed and you could access them. But those collections were precious resource. So we have been introduced to libraries with this idea of care, but we've taken it one step further, even with the idea of almost protection, right? So locked cupboards, you're not able to touch, you had to, ask someone for the book. So we had call cards. I had them in college, you're too young. But, we wrote the title, which meant I needed to know beforehand what I want to read. There was no way of discovery in a college library. And it was all about, came from a policy of protection, because librarians were held and are still held till today in some policies responsible when the books are not on the shelf, because books were considered an asset. It was considered some property of the institution. Now you imagine if I'm a librarian and every year there are 300 books missing and I'm docked for it, I'm going to become vigilant, correct? So historically, ownership became, I suspect, so proprietary because of this penalties, this who's held responsible. So of course it's easy to say, keep it open, let everybody use it, trust other people's recommendations. These are easy to say, but once you understand why you're doing it, they're also easy to live by. So you really need to examine why you're running the library. Is it to just have a collection as a showpiece, or is it to meet, as Amrita said, the needs of the reader? The minute you're meeting the needs of the reader, ownership is no longer yours, right? You're going to listen, you're going to co-own, you're going to, decide together whether to get a book or not get a book. The minute you co-own, that person's equally responsible for the care and placement, and everything shifts. I can assure you it begins to happen, but you've got to become clear for yourself, why you're doing what you're doing. Did that help, Sigi?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, quite a lot. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just wanted to jump in and say that very often it's just a shift in perspective that's needed, not like any great infrastructural inputs or anything, but that seems to be the hardest to achieve, right? Like I think others have also remarked in the chat.
Good afternoon, Lakshmi Mithod. I manage an initiative called Talking Circles. where children meet to recommend books that they have independently read. So prerequisite is access to a variety of books. I just wanted to highlight a perspective based on my experience, which parents have been discussing with me with respect to access to libraries. One common problem, so I'm talking in the context of urban areas. I am joining you all from Chennai. It's not that we don't have libraries here, we have libraries, but the problem that parents often share with me with access to libraries is that, especially if they are not avid readers themselves, they have trouble finding books that match their children's reading levels and interest in the libraries, which was to support the point that you all mentioned, that the librarian's job is not just stocking books, but to be knowledgeable about the books that are there, people who help a child pick a book that is suitable for him or her. And that's disturbing in the context of urban areas where libraries are not a problem. It's not like a rural area where somebody needs to go out there and get people out into the open to read books. That is one. And the second problem that parents face is the lack of willingness to pay for library subscriptions. They find it too expensive. Maybe there's a lack of awareness that books are expensive and they're running expenses in a library. But this is a problem in an urban area. I just wanted to know what your thoughts are about this problem and how can people like me doing small initiatives can make a difference in this field. Any suggestions you have?
Amrita, we should have had an eyebrow code or something. Who will take? I hear you very, very personally because I'm in a, based in Panjim, which is a kind of urban space. I hear this argument that people don't want to pay for libraries. Again, I believe it's coming from a historical idea of a social system where libraries should exist for society's well-being. Historically, see how we expect bus stops, buses. No, we expect certain services. We actually lump libraries there as well, saying they should be there. They should be free and accessible. So there is a question of conversation. No, I think for me, and this I really, learned to get deeper into because of being mentored by Usha Mukunda, that let's talk about it. This is how many millions of conversations started. I feel that's the best way with each parent or groups of parents to just first listen to them and see where this is coming from. Rather than we judge, they don't want to pay for libraries, but why? What is the problem they are seeing? Many parents feel we do the subscription and then our children are not reading. So then the problem is somewhere else. Now it's not about the payment. It's sometimes about now the books are at home, what to do. My child is not reading. So then we can talk about what can happen, or can we speak with the child? How can we engage with this child's interest? What can we do? Very hard to say all our success stories. The critical thing is to keep trying and to keep having faith. I've had mothers who say to me, you never give up, no? And that's the truth. I just won't give up. 6 months, I won't harass the child. Then I'll find out, what are you reading? Have you seen anything new? That would be one. The recommendations, I can't keep up. About 15 years back, I knew because I was younger and more able. The production was smaller. I was on top of what's coming out into the market. I can no longer keep up. But I'm so lucky to be surrounded by even children who are now teenagers, many, many young adults who are working in library work, who send me recommendations. And that way I'm keeping up. I can't do it all, but just being open, being connected, listening. So whoever's running a library, look for networks that will help you update yourself and know what to read, when to read, and make recommendations. And I think parents can, if they are urban now, technology savvy parents, I think there are recommended lists, blogs, Facebook groups, all of this alive now with book things. As you can see, I don't even have the vocabulary to name those, but I know they exist. So in this age, we shouldn't be worried about recommendations. We have to do little bit of finding, try, test, and see. This is my so quick. Again, I'm sorry if they're sounding like quick fixes, but that's my quick response.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, so I'll keep trying. I'll do my bit.
Yeah, Lakshmi, and the only thing I want to add when you said that how can small things, initiatives like yours make a difference, I think they are the ones which make a difference. That I think having that conviction and keeping at it and trying different ways to get there, I think that's the only thing I want to add.
Thank you.
And Lakshmi, this is Mani from Team Wishwa. I would also like to tell you that Wishwa is not only meant for NGOs. We also like to support self-starters, change makers such as yourself, and people who are working in remote areas. Whatever little that you are doing, please reach out to us if you are in need of any support, be it materials, book donations, funds. We will do everything that we can to help you in your initiatives. Please reach out to us at support@wishwa.org, and we would love to have a conversation with you. Now, Usha ma'am, do you feel there are any questions left in the chat box that you would like to address?
No, lots of questions, but I think I just wanted to make a very short plug, which Sujata has already put into the chat, which is that the December edition of Teacher Plus is actually a special on libraries. So maybe a lot of the remaining questions would be addressed in some of the pieces that we'll have in the issue. So do look out for it and get a copy. Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks everybody for these wonderful questions.
Thank you so much to all of you for turning up today. We've had a brilliant number of you turn up. So it's a testament to how many people are interested in books and libraries and preserving and revitalizing them. Hope to keep this conversation going on our social media. You can find us Wishwa India on Facebook, Instagram. And in a week's time, you will find the recording of this video on YouTube as well, in case you want to share it with your friends and family. I would like to thank all our speakers again for taking the time out to talk to us. It's been really, really insightful to hear you talk, and the passion with which that you speak. We can see the work that you've been doing and what drives you every single day. So thank you so much. With this, I would like to close this session.